I beg to move Amendment 107, which enjoys all-party support, and the purpose of which is to insert a new clause imposing a duty to disclose funds and economic resources. In a nutshell, my Lords, the amendment requires that sanctions regulations must, for the purposes of preventing an offence under those regulations, require designated persons to disclose all assets they own or control within the United Kingdom. Failure to disclose such assets is defined as a form of sanctions evasion, which is already criminalised under UK law and which could result in asset recovery under the Proceeds of Crime Act. The amendment is in line with the amendment which was debated at Grand Committee. One change has been made to reflect the helpful view of the Noble Lord, the Minister, Lord Sharp of Epsom, about proportionality. And I'm particularly grateful to the Noble Lords, Lord Garnier and Lord Fawkes, for their very helpful suggestion that the best way to ensure proportionality would be to incorporate the words just and equitable, which is what we have done in the revised amendment. In thanking those noble and learned lords, let me also thank the co-sponsors, the Noble Lord, Lord Lee of Hurley, the Noble Lord, Lord Coker, and the Noble Lord, Lord Fox. Their input and wisdom has been invaluable. The Noble Lord, the Minister, Lord Sharp, and his really excellent build team have engaged through meetings and in a flurry of emails and exchanges which have been admirable, and I'm grateful, my Lords, to them. Hopefully we can come to an amicable conclusion this evening. The topicality and urgency of this amendment was underlined by the statement made in another place yesterday on the Ukraine Recovery Conference and repeated here last night. All of us have been shocked by the sheer scale of the destruction unleashed by Putin's illegal war, the massive loss of life, the ruination of cities, towns, villages, and the destruction of the country's agricultural base. In this lamentable context, we are right to be planning for the future. The European Union has set aside a €50 billion recovery fund, and the United Kingdom has said we will provide loans worth $3 billion over the next 3 years. Globally, my Lord, some 500 businesses from 42 countries have pledged more than $5.2 trillion to back Ukraine's recovery. But as the Prime Minister made clear to that conference, Russia must pay for the destruction that it has inflicted. In this respect, the Foreign Secretary has said that the United Kingdom is working with allies to explore lawful routes to use frozen and immobilised Russian assets to fund Ukrainian reconstruction. And it was to enable that to happen that the movers of this amendment raised this question at Grand Committee. My Lords, to date the government has imposed sanctions on nearly 1,500 individuals, including 120 oligarchs, with a collective net worth exceeding £140 billion. However, to put that in perspective, the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation reports that in total just £18 billion of assets associated with Russia's regime have been frozen since the beginning of the war, and compare that, my Lords, with the net worth of £140 billion. The reason behind such discrepancy is simple. It's concealment. Oligarchs have found increasingly sophisticated ways to hide their assets and weaken our sanctions response, moving assets just before sanctions hit, exploiting loopholes to put assets out of reach, and concealing assets to hinder the enforcement of sanctions. I won't weary the House by repeating the examples that I gave of Abramovich and Nigina Zairova and the findings of the Transparency International organisation at committee stage, but I would commend that Hansard to the House. Our all-party amendment offers a two-pronged solution. Firstly, preventing Russian oligarchs from hiding their illicit wealth and evading sanctions, and secondly, enabling us to seize their assets when they attempt to evade sanctions using the Proceeds of Crime Act. Many of our allies have already taken steps to move from freeze to seize. In May of this year, the US seized assets from a Russian oligarch and was able to send the proceeds to Ukraine. Similarly, in line with this amendment, they managed to seize Konstantin Malofeyev's assets following findings that he had breached sanctions. Last year, the European Union introduced a similar duty to disclose sanctioned assets, and sanctions evasion has been standardised as a criminal offence right across all member states. The EU Commission has committed to working with international partners to seize more than $19 billion of Russian oligarchs' funds for the reconstruction of Ukraine. Let me also cite the use of Magnitsky sanctions and recognise the vital work of Bill Browder in promoting them. It's been one of the most significant avenues for justice and accountability introduced in recent years, and I would make a plea that I made in committee to create a parliamentary mechanism for these sanctions to be examined in camera if necessary. In welcoming this amendment before your lordships this evening, Bill Browder says this, I quote him directly: "Over the years we've seen how some manage to evade such sanctions, including by moving their assets shortly before sanctions. The UK must do more to ensure that sanctions evasion is addressed as a matter of urgency." In urging your lordships to support this amendment, he says, if we're serious about justice and accountability, we need to ensure that the very system that was designed to punish human rights violators is not made a mockery of by criminals. Let me end, my lords, by reminding the House that during our committee proceedings, we were joined in the public gallery by Sebastian Lai, the son of the imprisoned Hong Kong founder of Apple Daily, and leading pro-democracy advocate Jimmy Lai, a British citizen who, as things stand, could well die in jail. I declare my interest as a patron of Hong Kong Watch. This amendment has particular relevance for those Hong Kong officials, judges, prosecutors and police officers who are currently complicit in ongoing human rights violations in the city. Many of these individuals and their families have assets in the UK and in some cases even hold UK passports. Hong Kong officials, like Russian officials before them, hide their assets through family members and obscure family trusts. Our amendment would ensure that when ministers finally impose sanctions on those responsible for the deepening crackdown in Hong Kong, we will be able to readily identify and seize their assets across the UK by forcing them to disclose them. If the government cannot accept this amendment tonight, but can at least commit to introducing early secondary legislation to achieve this amendment's purpose, I and the other movers of the amendment will be more than happy to engage with the government to make the regime as effective as is humanly possible. And I will listen this evening with great care to the Noble Lord the Minister before deciding whether to take this amendment to a division. Let me end where I began, in Ukraine, reminding the House of how important it is that we support Ukraine in every possible way. Latest figures show that over 9,000 civilians have died and over 8.2 million people have fled the country. Reconstruction efforts have been estimated at over $400 billion, and the figure rises exponentially. Amendment 107 was tabled to assert the principle that those responsible for or who have collaborated in these depredations will be made to contribute to the gargantuan task of reconstruction, and that we in this House are making clear by speeches, by amendments of this kind, by our actions, that we will go on supporting the courageous people of Ukraine by every possible means. I beg to move.
Amendment proposed after clause 187, insert the new clause as printed on the marshalled list.
My Lords, I'm pleased to support the bill in the name of my noble friend, and if I don't speak at length on this, it's not because I don't think it's a very important amendment, it's because I'm trying to infect the rest of the House with some brevity, unsuccessfully, I suspect. But this is an important amendment, and I think we've seen movement in other regimes. We've seen movement in the United States, we're seeing movement in the European Union, and I think we've seen movement in the House of Commons over the procurement bill, where we've started to see changes in attitude. And I'm hoping that we will hear from the Minister shortly that the government is beginning to move and prepared to move in order, if you like, for us to bank a step in the right direction along this point. So we're looking forward to hear what the Minister has to say, and hopefully this amendment will not have to be moved if we hear what we want to hear. So.
Well, my Lords, I thank the noble Lord Alton of Liverpool for this amendment and for his constructive engagement throughout the passage of this bill through this House, and of course for his typically thoughtful and powerful introduction. I'd also like to pay tribute to the way in which noble lords from all sides of the House, as well as members in the other place, continue to pursue this important issue and engage with the government on a cross-party basis, and not least the work of the APPG on anti-corruption and responsible tax. I can reassure the noble lord that the government is supportive of having mechanisms to deprive sanctioned individuals, where appropriate, of their assets with a view to funding the recovery and reconstruction of Ukraine. More broadly, the government wants to drive further transparency around assets held by sanctioned persons in the UK. On the 19th of June, the government announced 4 new commitments which reaffirm that Russia must pay for the long-term reconstruction of Ukraine. This includes new legislation that was laid the same day by the Foreign Secretary to enable sanctions to remain in place until Russia pays compensation for damage caused. Within this announcement, the government also confirmed that it will lay new legislation requiring persons and entities in the UK or UK persons and entities overseas who are designated under the Russia financial sanctions regime to disclose any assets they hold in the UK. The government is firmly committed to bringing forward this secondary legislation, subject to the made affirmative procedure, to introduce this measure before the end of 2023, subject to the usual parliamentary scheduling. This strengthens the transparency of assets and makes clear that the UK will not allow assets to be hidden in this country. Sanctioned individuals who fail to disclose their assets could receive a financial penalty or have their assets confiscated. This demonstrates our continued commitment to penalise those who make deliberate attempts to conceal funds or economic resources. The new power builds on and strengthens the UK's existing powers around transparency of designated persons' assets. HMG already uses the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementations, known as OFSI, annual review to collect and detail assets frozen under UK financial sanctions. Additionally, relevant firms such as banks, other financial institutions, law firms and estate agents have an ongoing obligation to report to OFSI if they know or reasonably suspect a person is a designated person or has committed offences under financial sanctions regulations where that information is received in the course of carrying on their business. Those firms must provide information about the nature and amount of any funds or economic resources held by that firm for the customer. The designated person reporting measure will act as a dual verification tool by enabling the comparison of disclosures against existing reporting requirements that bite on relevant firms. This will tighten the net around those who are not reporting and are evading their reporting requirements. On asset seizure, prosecutors and/or law enforcement agencies are currently able to apply to confiscate or permanently seize assets where someone has benefited from their offending or the assets have links to criminality, by making use of powers under the Proceeds of Crime Act of 2002. Importantly, the new measures will also give His Majesty's Government the ability to impose fines. Overall, this designated person reporting measure will be focused on strengthening the UK's compliance toolkit while giving options for penalising those who seek to hide their assets. The Noble Lord's amendment includes a specific provision which would require the designated person to also report assets which were held 6 months prior to the designation. The government is still fully developing the non-disclosure measure, and I can assure the Noble Lord that we are carefully considering this suggestion. Although not retrospective in terms of regulating or criminalising conduct that occurred before the measure came into force, requiring designated persons to provide a snapshot of their assets at a historical point in time is necessarily more onerous than a forward-look requirement. The government will need to carefully consider the design of the measure and the proportionality and additional value of so-called retrospective reporting to ensure it is operationally deliverable and legally robust. And this will include working with the relevant law enforcement agencies to determine how such information would be used. Before laying these regulations, the government will complete its ongoing evaluation of the possible operational or implementation challenges to help ensure the successful delivery of this measure. For example, investigating non-compliance will require significant resources from the enforcing agency, and we want to ensure that they have all the capabilities, skills and resources to succeed. Now, I obviously note the interest and strength of feeling on this issue. The government will continue to work collaboratively and constructively with interested parties in the lead-up to bringing forward the legislation, including on the matter of reporting assets which were held prior to a designation. We will continue to engage with the civil society organisations who have campaigned for this measure, and of course I will also be happy to work with the Noble Lord, Lord Alton and other parliamentarians to keep them informed of progress ahead of the measure being formally introduced. So I once again thank the Noble Lord for bringing this issue forward for debate and the continued interest and engagement from many stakeholders. I hope, given the reasons I've outlined and the action which government is already taking, the noble lord will consider withdrawing his amendment.
My Lords, I'm extremely grateful to the noble Lord Sharp for the manner in which he has addressed this issue and indeed addressed the House this evening. He was right to pay tribute to the all-party parliamentary group on anti-corruption and responsible tax, and I would link with that the specific work of Dame Margaret Hodge MP, the Royal United Services Institute, and many of those in civil society that the noble Lord has referred to. I was especially pleased to hear what he had to say about working collaboratively with those who have been involved in this amendment, but in those organisations in taking this forward. I don't underestimate the importance of what the noble Lord has just said to the House. First of all, he has said that he'll look at one outstanding issue, and that's the 6-month retrospective period, and although giving no guarantees and no assurances on that front, but at least that will be something that we can discuss and examine further. But, my Lords, what the noble Lord has agreed to is to introduce secondary legislation before the end of the year, so not at a time to be agreed, not some possibility of legislation coming in the next 9 months, 10 months, but by the end of this year. I welcome that very much. And he also told the House it would be done under the affirmative procedure, which will give us the chance as well to come back again. Significant progress has been made on this, my Lords. I'm very grateful to the noble Lord, and I'm also very happy to withdraw the amendment.